This is the first class intended for parents and teachers on the art of reasoning. Reasoning is the second of the three arts of the classical trivium, one of the seven classical liberal arts. And it's important to always remind ourselves what the liberal arts were and why they really should always be the focus of Catholic education. In our grammar class, we discussed the goal and purpose of grammar and that it helps to develop in us a subtlety and exactness of language that allows us to think and speak and communicate clearly and effectively because truth is complex. The art of reasoning, like the art of grammar, applies to all subjects or all arts and sciences, and therefore it's one of the core liberal arts on which all true learning is based. In this first video, what I'd like to discuss is what reasoning is and what it's not. I'd like to distinguish it, especially in our generation, from things that are falsely taught about the art of reasoning, and to help you understand what it is so that you can begin reading the writings of philosophers or even theologians like Thomas Aquinas and understand what they're talking about, because you rightly understand what reasoning is and what it's not, because this becomes an obstacle. When we teach oversimplified and false ideas, they may get us through a class, but they ultimately become roadblocks for students to be able to progress. And they're signs that we're not actually interested in progressing as students ourselves when we teach such things. So what I'd like to do is talk about what reasoning is, then I'd like to talk about the source of our studies in reasoning, which is Aristotle's Organon, and then give a quick flyover of the 6 different books that compose the Organon, which we'll be studying in the classical reasoning courses in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. So first of all, if you look around at school curricula, first of all, if you look at modern schools, you'll find that there is no reasoning class in the curriculum. It's amazing to think about that, but if you look at a modern high school curriculum, you'll find that there may be 8 or 9 subjects studied by students at all 4 grade levels in high school, but reasoning is not one of the subjects in the curriculum. And yet, you'll hear people talking all the time about how important critical thinking is for students, and yet reasoning is not in the curriculum. Now, this is a complex issue that should be discussed, because what the modern schools do in talking about and encouraging quote-unquote critical thinking without teaching the art of reasoning is actually the error that Plato warns of in the Republic when he talks about education. He talks about the fact that dialectic or dialectical reasoning can actually produce evil in students by getting them started with critical thinking, arguing, disputing, before they really have a foundation for truth-seeking, because what it will do is lead them to agnosticism, where they just don't believe anything is true. And that's what modern schools essentially do. So we're not talking about critical thinking. We're not talking about some modern teaching method that tries to get children to discuss things and express their thoughts and dispute with other students in a literature class, for example. That's not what reasoning is. This is the art of reasoning. This is a system of terms and definitions and principles and rules that make up a complete art of human reasoning. Now, many schools today will start up and claim to be classical schools, and one of the focal points in the school will be the study of what they call logic. And then you'll get into this Dorothy Sayers stuff where you're taught that grammar is like the germination stage of learning, and then reasoning or logic is sort of the argumentative teenager stage of learning and developing, and then rhetoric is sort of like the fruit producing adult intellectual. Like that's all modern psychology with words stuck onto it that that really have nothing to do with the art of classical reasoning. The Dorothy Sayers stuff is passed around because it's easy for everyone to understand. It works to sell tuition and textbooks, but it has nothing to do with the actual art of classical reasoning. So with modern critical thinking and with this sort of fake classical logic stage teaching set aside, let's talk about what classical reasoning really is. Okay? The best explanation for what reasoning is found in the title of Aristotle's work, which contains all of his works on reasoning. The Greek word organon means instrument or method. It's the method of investigation. So if we want to know the truth, we want to seek wisdom. There's a lot to talk about, sort of background information, and I'd like to say a few things about what philosophy is and how it works, because that'll help us to understand why Aristotle refers to reasoning as the organon, or the method of investigation. St. Thomas explains that wisdom is the ability to order things. That's what wisdom is. A wise man orders things. And then he goes on to explain how there are different classes of things to be ordered. He starts with the natural world, or visible things in the natural world. And he says the order of the natural world is studied in natural philosophy. That's what we're seeking when we study natural philosophy. We're seeking to know the order of the natural world. And he explains that the order of the natural world was created by God. And so in the study of natural philosophy, we're trying to understand the order that God himself set in the natural world that allows us to understand how all things work. Because our job, remember in the Garden of Eden, Adam is told to till the ground and keep it. His job is to manage the natural world. He is the one who is to preserve the order that God had established in nature. That was his job. He was the custodian of nature. In natural philosophy, we seek to know the order of nature. And then if we go on to what's called rational philosophy, which is reasoning, we seek to order our ideas and thoughts so that they're true. We study a different kind of order in the art of reasoning. And then if we go on to ethics, we're seeking to order our will and order our affections so that we can pursue happiness. And that's wisdom. Wisdom is the ordering of things in different categories or classes of knowledge. Reasoning is the organon for that investigation. Reasoning is the method or the instrument by which we seek to know the order of things and to impose order, the true order, upon things. Reasoning is the method. Okay, so we can say that this system of reasoning that Aristotle teaches in classical reasoning is the Aristotelian or the philosophical method. Okay, so this is how we investigate. This is the toolbox by which we investigate all of the questions that are studied in philosophy. So if you want to be a wise man, that is, if you want to be a true philosopher, reasoning is the instrument or the method that you need to use in order to gain that wisdom. That's the meaning of the term organon, the title of Aristotle's work on reasoning. A quick historical note that's important for us to think about even as we get started. If we were to take this word organon and turn it into Latin, we would have the Latin word organum. Organum. That's the Latin translation of organon. In 1620, Francis Bacon published a work that was titled the Novum Organum, which means the new method. And this is what we refer to today as the quote-unquote scientific method. And it's important for us to understand that This Aristotelian method, or this philosophical method, was replaced by what we now call the scientific method. There was a massive shift in human learning that took place in the 1600s. And this is why this is not in modern schools. If you look at a modern school, you'll see a school that's organized around mathematics and natural sciences. It's not important that they're natural sciences. What's important is the method by which knowledge is pursued in modern science. It's pursued according to the scientific method rather than according to the Aristotelian method. Now, what it means to be scholastic, to be a scholastic philosopher or just a scholastic, is to pursue truth using the organon, the classical Aristotelian method for pursuing truth. That's the difference between a classical mind and a modern mind. So I want to introduce that to you at the beginning of this study because I want to talk about it constantly as we go through these studies of classical reasoning. So what reasoning is the art of forming judgments in our minds. It's natural to man. When God created man, he created within man the faculty of reasoning. Our minds perform these operations naturally. You don't need to learn reasoning to begin reasoning. You already reason, from the youngest years of your life. We talk about in the Catholic faith, we talk about the age of reason being 7 or 8 years old, when children seem to begin to think and act reasonably, or they begin to at least seek to understand the reasons in things. That doesn't mean that there's no reason in a child or that reasoning is not operating before age 7, because it surely is. It's that as they grow, they develop sort of a self-control that begins to allow reasoning to emerge as the guiding principle in their behavior. Whereas when they're young, they're just sort of screaming infants that they just have impulses and desires, and they seek to gratify those desires by throwing tantrums and yelling and screaming. Age 7 or 8, they start to mature, grow out of that baby toddler stage and begin to act more responsibly and become more responsible for their actions. So the age of reasoning helps us to see that reasoning is something that's natural to man. It's not something that's gained through education. It's a natural human faculty. And what I would argue is that it's the intended method or organon of the Creator for human beings seeking the truth in this life. It's the method that was installed in our system as our guide to truth in this world as far as human affairs are concerned. So reasoning is a natural faculty that's put in us by which our minds or our souls naturally and automatically draw conclusions. And what the art of reasoning is a detailed study of that process and how our mind forms these conclusions. The reason why it's important for us to study the art of reasoning is because even though we have this faculty by nature in us, it's possible, as we can easily prove, for that faculty to make false conclusions. And there are reasons for that. Sometimes it's because a word is being used incorrectly. Sometimes there's an intentionally deceiving or misleading argument that's being presented, an illusion of reasoning. And so because there is this possible confusion and error in our reasoning, and because men intentionally seek to exploit these weaknesses in human reasoning, Aristotle sought to systematize reasoning as an art that can be studied and perfected so that we could protect ourselves and avoid being deceived by sophistical reasonings or false appearances of arguments. Now, it's important to see that in the Garden of Eden, we see man created in the image and likeness of God. That image primarily consists in the soul, And one of the qualities of the soul is that it's capable of reasoning. We see that that's essential to human nature, and it's essential to that creation story. And what we find in the Garden of Eden is the temptation is that man will resist a tree which contains the knowledge of good and evil. So man's inclination to pursue knowledge actually can get him into trouble. And what we find also in the garden is a deceiver who seeks to mislead man with false arguments and reasons and lead him into sin and disobedience. St. Ignatius said the devil is a sophist. And therefore, for Christians and for all human beings, but particularly for Christians, there is even greater motivation to study the art of reasoning, because it will not only protect and help us when we face human sophistical arguments, but it will also help us to be able to understand demonic sophistical arguments, which come in the form of temptations. Okay, so the art of reasoning is definitely of interest to Christians, because this is one of the primary means that we have to develop strength to resist temptations, because many temptations are simply lies and misrepresentations and sophisms that the devil uses to deceive and lead us into disobedience. So reasoning is a natural faculty. It's a great power that God gives to us. It's a faculty that he intends for us to use to learn about the world that he's created, about ourselves and about him as well. But the problem with human reasoning is for a number of causes, it's capable of error, and therefore we can improve our ability to reason rightly by studying the art of reasoning and avoiding the errors, learning to avoid the potential sources of error in our reasoning. And that's the purpose and benefit of studying classical reasoning, why it was always a central focus of the curriculum in Catholic schools all through church history. Reasoning was the focus in classical Catholic education, because not only does it allow us to investigate philosophical sciences, it also helps us to avoid temptation and deception. And so there's much more to gain by the study of classical reasoning than just some intellectual skill in debating and things like that. It's much more essential and central to the Catholic curriculum in Catholic education. Now, this method was established by Aristotle primarily because he saw firsthand the ability of sophists to mislead people. And he wanted to get really to the root of the issue, to understand reasoning as an art so that it could be perfected and these kinds of dangers be removed in a society. He put together 6 books that describe each different division of the art of reasoning. And these 6 books taken together compose what's known as the organon, or the method of investigation. Now, we'll see that there's sort of a progression in these studies, which is important. There's an order to these studies that need to be followed in our study of them. But we'll see that, again, there's confusion about what these things are because of the use of these words and phrases in modern classical schools that's actually creating false teaching about the art of reasoning. We'll hear a lot in modern circles about the so-called Socratic Method. So we'll hear a lot about the Socratic Method. And what we find, if we investigate to see what are people talking about when they talk about the Socratic Method, they're claiming that the Socratic Method is a method of learning, which really boils down into having class discussions and talking about things, asking questions and discussing rather than lecturing with formal points in a systematic lecture in class. We'll discuss it, we'll ask questions, we'll explore different ideas, we'll use the Socratic method in education. Well, that's not what the Socratic method is. The Socratic method is learned in Book 5 of Aristotle's Organon, in the Topics. And what the Socratic method is the method of investigation that was developed by Socrates, and it's called Dialectical Reasoning. It's one kind of reasoning, dialectical reasoning. And I'm not going to get into what that is because we're going to study that through this entire course. But the true Socratic method is the method of investigation that's taught by Aristotle in the Topics. So the true Socratic method, we'll study that. It's in the Topics. We'll get there. It's dialectical reasoning. But what's more important is demonstrative reasoning, which is the real glory and focus of Aristotle's teaching on reasoning. Demonstrative reasoning is the reasoning used in the development and pursuit of the philosophical sciences. Demonstrative reasoning is Aristotle's real achievement, establishing that art of demonstrative reasoning. What we see here is the Organon begins with categories. And if you look at a Protestant book on logic, there's one that's popular. It was written by Isaac Watts called Logic, the Right Use of Reason in the Pursuit of Truth. And Isaac Watts, who was a great Protestant hymn writer, goes off in one section of the book criticizing Aristotle's categories, because there are 10 categories established by Aristotle, and Isaac Watts complains about how stupid it is to try to suggest that all of the things in the world can be organized in these 10 categories. And so the first danger we have in understanding reasoning is to remember what we're talking about, okay? Reasoning is not natural philosophy. We're not talking about the order of visible things in the world. We're not talking about the order of physical objects. We're talking about ideas, things that exist in our mind. Everything we talk about in reasoning has to do with ideas and words, not about objects, not about physical bodies and things created outside of us. This is reasoning. This is rational philosophy. This is the ordering and study of ideas and words that exist within our minds. So in this first book by Aristotle on the categories, he's not suggesting that all of the objects in the natural world can be categorized into 10 classes. That's not what he's talking about. What he's saying is that as our mind by nature, by reason, connects things, it makes connections between subjects and predicates. Our mind does that naturally. Anytime you look at something and say, what is this? You say, that person is Socrates. You're combining the idea of Socrates with the idea of this person, and you're saying they are together. They are true together. All of the predicates, anything that can be said of a subject, anything that can be predicated of a subject, the Greek word for a predicate is categoria. So the categories are just, we can understand this as predicates. The 10 classes of predicates, or things that can be said about a subject. And in the categories, he lists the 10 categories, the 10 kinds of predicates, or things that can be said about a subject. And he classifies them, and we'll look at them in one of our next lessons on reasoning. But the categories is not an attempt to categorize the natural world. It's not an attempt to organize all plants, animals, rocks, trees into categories. It's organizing the possible predicates that can be used with any subject in thinking. The categories of what are called the predicables. That's the first of the works of Aristotle's Organons. What can we say about a thing, and into how many categories can those predicates be grouped? That's the categories. The second book is on interpretation, and on interpretation, it basically compares to syntax in grammar. We seek to understand how propositions are formed, because in analytics and the topics, we're going to talk about how arguments can be formed. So categories, we're looking at predicates and subjects and what can be predicated of any subject. In interpretation, we're looking at how propositions are constructed and the qualities of propositions. And then we get into the two works on analytics, prior analytics and posterior analytics. This word analytics is important because it refers to demonstrative reasoning, or this philosophical reasoning that Aristotle is famous for developing as an art. Both of the books of analytics cover demonstrative reasoning. Now, there's one thing that's important to note about this, is that the place that these books have in human history. We live in 2000 AD. We're 2400 years after Aristotle. When Aristotle was born, this art of demonstrative reasoning did not exist. Aristotle was born with Socrates and Plato being the great philosophers, and they employed the dialectical method. Aristotle was raised in that Platonic school, learning the dialectical method, which he himself teaches in the Topics, but his achievement, his great achievement, was developing and teaching the systematic art of demonstrative reasoning. And in the books, Analytics, Prior and Posterior, he presents the teaching on demonstrative reasoning. Now, in history, when he was revealing this, when he was developing and teaching this, he bore the burden of proving that these things are true. He had to not only teach the art, but he had to prove that the subject itself of demonstrative reasoning was in fact true. So there's a lot of time and ink spent in these books proving things that we already understand and take for granted in 2000 AD. He has to deal with all different philosophical schools that existed at the time, which don't even exist today, or which are known to be false today. And he had to prove them false and prove his teaching true. So a lot of the content of the analytics is really unnecessary for us. We have to sift through it to find the actual principles and teachings of the art, because that's what we're interested in. But he spends a lot of time proving the truth of his teaching on rational philosophy in these books. Analytics teaches us the art of the syllogism. That is the formal structure of an argument, what is actually reasoning. So the syllogism is the key lesson in the analytics, and really the key lesson of reasoning in general is understanding how a syllogism or argument is formed and what it actually consists of. Now, what's important about the syllogism is that Aristotle explains how human reasoning works. He says, if you present the mind with two propositions that possess between them a certain relationship, our minds will immediately discern that relationship and draw a conclusion based on those two propositions. It's just sort of an automatic function of our minds. And that process of combining propositions, discerning a relationship, and drawing a conclusion is the process or operation of reasoning. And in the analytics, Aristotle gets into the forms of syllogisms, how that process works, and what makes for a true or false syllogism. He then goes on to the Topics in the 5th book, and he describes a different kind of reasoning. Whereas the analytics address demonstrative reasoning, Topics addresses dialectical reasoning. The difference between these is very simple. In demonstrative reasoning, the premises from which reasoning begins must be absolutely certain, either self-evident or previously demonstrated. A good example of analytics would be in the art of geometry, where either we're starting with axioms and definitions, and then we're solving propositions, and then the solutions or the conclusions of the propositions can be used as premises for future solutions for propositions. Everything in geometry is absolutely certain because geometry is a demonstrative science. It's demonstrative. That's the study in analytics, demonstrative reasoning, where we reason from absolutely certain truths to absolutely certain conclusions. And you can see why that's necessary for the development of philosophical sciences. Everything has to be absolutely certain, because that's what wisdom is. Dialectical reasoning taught in the topics, the Socratic method, is something different. It's not as exact as demonstrative reasoning. In dialectical reasoning, which you see in all of the dialogues of Plato, which are examples of the dialectical reasoning method of investigation, the Socratic method. In Plato's dialogues, what you see is that questions are proposed to someone with whom we're speaking. A question is proposed, and the question is a controversial question that has a yes or no answer. And then the person questioned answers or responds with one of the two options. And then that answer is then taken for granted and used in future syllogisms or arguments. And so dialectical reasoning is based on the response of one being disputed with. And then that response is taken for granted and used as a premise for future arguments. Dialectical reasoning is useful for showing that things that someone says are impossible because they lead to contradiction, which is what we see Socrates doing in the Platonic dialogues. We see him collecting answers to questions from someone he's discussing a subject with, and then showing that their answers, which seemed to them to be true at the time when they were given, lead to necessary contradictions that prove that something must be wrong about what they said. So dialectical reasoning is great for proving that someone's position on a topic is impossible. But what dialectical reasoning rarely can accomplish is to establish any positive, certain truth. That's really not what dialectical or the Socratic method is used for. It's used for eliminating answer choices, but not for proving what the right answer choice is. Analytics and demonstrative science, in demonstrative reasoning, Aristotle argues that we can prove positively what is true if we draw conclusions from premises that we already know are absolutely certain. So that's the difference between the Aristotelian method, taught and developed in the Analytics, and the Socratic method, which is explained by Aristotle because it already existed in the Topics. Okay, so demonstrative reasoning and dialectical reasoning. And then lastly, in the sixth book, Aristotle goes through what are called Sophistical Refutations. He explains what's wrong with the false arguments used by Sophists, false arguers, usually people who were motivated by some financial gain, whether it was in the courts representing people as lawyers or orators, whether it was leading the people in votes, trying to mislead the people to vote a certain way. They would make very skillful and clever use of false arguments that appeared to be reasonable, and they were impossible for most common people to resist. And in this sixth book, Aristotle categorizes the tactics of sophists and explains what's wrong with the arguments that they use and why they're not true arguments, because they don't follow the rules of true syllogisms. So he explains that in Sophistical Refutations, and this is where we find a list of what are known as the logical fallacies. Okay, if you want to study the fallacies, those are taught in Aristotle's Sophistical Refutations. Now, that whole system of books, all six, together form the Organon, which is a complete system of the art of reasoning. It includes both the Socratic method, taught in the Topics, and the Aristotelian, or what will be called the Scholastic method, that's taught in the Analytics. Scholasticism is the application of demonstrative reasoning to what St. Thomas called sacred doctrine or theology. That's scholastic philosophy. Okay? Those six books form the Organon. Again, we have to beware of the misuse of terms like Socratic Method. The Socratic Method isn't simply questioning answers. It's not class discussion. It's a very systematic and strategic form of questioning that asks a certain type of question and then uses a certain type of reasoning to draw conclusions to show that answers given to those questions are impossible. That's the Socratic Method. Socrates is considered to be sort of an annoying character because all he does is prove people are wrong. He just goes around showing that everything everyone says can't possibly be true. And what that leads to is a sense that we don't have the truth figured out. And you can see how in his place in history, Socrates, in the presence of all of this supposed wisdom in ancient Greece, Socrates was a voice saying, the things that we're teaching and believing are not true. And I can prove this by a dialectical investigation. We can prove that our beliefs and teachings about these different things are not true. But what Socrates could not do is establish the positive truth. Aristotle largely did that work in his philosophical writings, and this is why we see, if we read the Summa Theologica, Thomas quoting Aristotle as a source and authority in Catholic doctrine. Aristotle quoted as a source for Catholic doctrine because the arguments and reasoning used by Aristotle to establish his philosophical teachings were demonstrated and therefore considered certain, not mere opinions as if they were dialectical arguments. Aristotle's teaching is not treated by St. Thomas as the opinion of one person that we'll take for granted in an argument. St. Thomas presents Aristotle's conclusions in his philosophical works as demonstrated facts that can be used to now reason about even more mysterious topics like theology. And then, as I said, lastly, the fallacies in the Sophistical Refutations. So that system of reasoning, that's what we mean by the art of reasoning in the classical liberal arts curriculum. You can imagine from those topics that I've just described that there is a ton of content in these books, and these are long and difficult studies. If you remember what I described in our lesson on grammar, I said that the goal in grammar is to take children who are like 8 packs of crayons and lead them to become 64 packs of crayons. I hope that you can see clearly how reasoning is really where that transformation happens. Understanding dialectical reasoning, which we learn is counterpart to rhetoric, as we'll talk about in our lesson on rhetoric. Dialectical reasoning relates and is used in the art of reasoning, in the art of persuasive speaking in rhetoric, because we're usually engaging an audience and trying to persuade others. That's where we use dialectical reasoning. But in philosophy, in the investigation of the philosophical sciences, analytics, demonstrative reasoning is the method that's employed to establish positive truth. Now, one last point. You remember before I wrote about Bacon and the scientific method. The argument in the 1600s, which is crucial today for us to think about and discuss, is whether demonstrative reasoning or scientific experimentation should be the method by which truth is established by human beings. The argument for the scientific method is that demonstrative reasoning is not a sure guide. And this entire system of Aristotle has been rejected and literally thrown away by modern society and replaced with scientific experimentation. Okay? That shift in human learning and thinking, I argue, and I'm willing to say this publicly, I argue that that shift was a colossal error in human history. The reason why I'm interested in teaching and restoring the classical liberal arts is because I believe that we are lost at sea as human beings until we restore the Aristotelian method as the method by which we investigate all questions in life and seek to establish absolutely certain truth to build our lives on. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy should be understood as a rejection of the modern turning to the scientific method, which we find in modern schools, where there are no reasoning classes, there is no Aristotle, it's all science and math, laboratories, experiments, opinions based on your own experience, self-expression. All of these things relate to the scientific method, the method but where we investigate the truth by our own experience and tangible, sensible observations of the world around us. I believe that that's false, and I believe the restoration of Aristotle's demonstrative method is necessary for Catholic education and thought to ever be restored. So I just want to throw that out there as sort of a controversial topic to think about and talk about. And as you work in schools and look at what the curriculum is that's offered by your school or in your home school, you consider how science and math fits into classical reasoning and rhetoric and grammar. I want you to see that there is a real dilemma that needs to be discussed and worked through in these matters of curriculum and learning. And it's not just coincidental that the modern schools, Catholic schools included, don't teach reasoning. There's a problem, and it needs to be fixed. Hopefully, as we go through this set of lessons, you as teachers and parents will be part of the solution in fixing that and putting reasoning back as the focus of the curriculum and setting the scientific method, which is useful, into its proper place. And you'll see as I teach modern natural science classes in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, you'll see how I explain the right use of the scientific method and where it fits into the bigger picture of human learning. So I hope that's helpful. We're going to go into all these books in some detail over the rest of this course as we fly through the art of classical reasoning. But what you should know at the end of this video is what reasoning is in terms of the 7 liberal arts, what reasoning is. You should understand how what I'm talking about in reasoning differs from critical thinking in a modern school. You should understand what's different about what I'm talking about in classical reasoning from what a modern classical school might refer to as logic, okay? You should understand what's different between reasoning and the quote-unquote Socratic method, which we find popping up in modern schools and homeschool programs. And then you should understand that what really needs to be studied to understand the art of reasoning is the Organon of Aristotle, which consists of these 6 books, which are taught in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Classical Reasoning program. So I hope that's a helpful introduction. I'm sorry if I spoke fast and ran through things quickly. This video is already over 40 minutes, and I'm trying to get through the necessary introductory information. But these topics are so interesting to me, and I'm sorry if I rambled a bit, but I hope that you see the core focal points of the study of reasoning, what the goal of reasoning is, and then what your role is as the teacher. You're not going to teach these things. Aristotle is a genius, uniquely gifted individual in the whole history of human learning. Our job is just to help our students study and learn what Aristotle taught. And I hope I can help you do that as we go through these lessons. So that's an introduction to classical reasoning. I hope that's a helpful start. If there's anything you'd like to discuss or talk about, please send any questions or chat, post on the forum, whatever you'd like to do. I look forward to helping and working with you as we go through this study. God bless.